explore different issues with one another. As has come up, the meeting's being recorded, and so, yeah, it is. And the only thing left for me to do really at this stage is to introduce William, who's our speaker. William Wade is speaking about outreach and evangelism to those on the margins of church. And perhaps most importantly, he's one of us. So he knows the realities of ministry as well as the realities of the margins of society and church life. So, William, let me pray for you and then let you begin. Father, thank you for the experience and the knowledge and the wisdom that so many of us have in Baptist ministry and our willingness to share it with one another. Thanks you for William, particularly this morning. And as he blesses us and stretches us, may he also be blessed by you. Amen. William, over to you.
And thank you so much. It's great to see you all today, and you'll recognize straight away that I'm not from around these parts, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a testimony to start us off and link that in with an observation on how we engage with people when we talk about the good news, when we talk about the gospel, and give us just a couple of minutes of reflection to see if that's true in your case. And for the rest of today, we're going to look a little bit at postmodernism and how that shapes how we engage with people, looking at some of the difficulties, looking at some of the opportunities as well. And we'll look at some shifts in engaging with people from a traditional standpoint, viewpoint. Some would say maybe evangelical, looking towards a more progressive, some would say more liberal outlook on how we engage with people. And the big takeaway, hopefully, from today is going to be where we get to the end of our time together. And you have some time, and we'll prayerfully look at this, you have some time to look at perhaps how you can engage with your own context in a way that is applicable to where you're at as a minister, where your church is at, perhaps, and also where your community is at, and look at how we will go into 2021, 2022, and have an evangelistic outlook on how we engage with the community. So that's where we're going. But let me tell you a little bit about myself. So currently I'm a minister in Life Church in Cuffley, so a BU church and a fairly affluent area. But it hasn't been the case all the way through my ministry. Before here, I was a minister in an international church in The Hague in the Netherlands, and I was also a minister in an international Baptist church in Dusseldorf in Germany. And I also spent 14 years as a missionary evangelist, British forces, mostly in Germany, and also in Colchester in Essex with the Paras, which was an adventure. But I come from Belfast, and I was brought up in a difficult home. It was a very violent home. My father was a violent man, and he beat my mother like he would beat a man, and that was difficult to grow up in. It was an abusive home, and whenever you have a background like that, the old saying is true: fractured places produce fractured people. And so by the age of 10, I was an angry kid. And there was an opportunity at that age to get into things that were going to be destructive, self-destructive for me. One was solvent abuse. So I was first high at the age of 10 with glue sniffing when the skinhead movement came across and impacted Northern Ireland. Took my first recreational drugs at 11, started drinking, which was a rite of passage back then at 12. And then you can kind of figure out the rest of the script. Went to a good school, but was expelled in my final year there. And then started getting into trouble with the police. And it was linked with what was going on in our housing estate with paramilitary lifestyle. My father was involved to some extent. And so in this mess that I'd gotten myself into, I've been arrested quite a few times, had 5 counts on my police record. I was having a party one Saturday evening in one of my sister's houses, And really, out of the blue, there was a knock at the door, 9:30, 10 o'clock in the evening. And I answered the door. Everyone that was in the party, all young men between the ages of 16, 18, 19. And I answered the door, and it was two 15-year-old girls asking could they come into the party. And as I was hosting it, I said, yeah, of course you can come in. They were pretty young girls, and of course we weren't going to say no. So they came in, and one of the girls went over to the stack stereo, if any of you remember what stack stereo systems look like, and did a very brave thing. She turned the music off, and the two girls stood in the center of the room. This is zero exaggeration. I know when we tell stories like this, we tend to embellish them a bit, but this actually happened. The two girls stood in the center of the room and told us all that there was a God and that he had a son called Jesus, and that this Jesus died for us, and that we needed to get right with him. And they used words like saved and born again, and they shared some of their testimony, and they challenged us to go to church with them the next evening. And in an attempt to get rid of them, we said, yes, we'll go. So they left, and we just carried on with the party. But the next evening, there were 7 of us standing just on a street corner. It was just before 6 p.m. And the two girls came round the corner, as fate would have it, and they held us to the promise. And we said, listen, we only said that so you could leave. We're not going to church. It isn't our scene. It's not what we do. But they just wouldn't quit. They said, no, you promised you're going to go with us. It's our Sunday evening gospel service. And so we didn't really have a clue what they were talking about. But one of my friends said, listen, we're not doing anything else. Let's go and we'll have a bit of a laugh. So that's exactly what we did. The 7 of us with these two girls marched down to this, it was a church plant. It was a little corrugated iron shack, a Nissan hut on the edge of the estate. We walked in, and the little service had already started. There were about 12 people there, most of them fairly elderly. But there was one young guy leading choruses at the start, at the front with a guitar. And so we filed in, sat along the back row as you do, and kind of made a mockery of everything that was going on. We kicked the chairs around, pointed, laughed, joked. But then when the preacher stood up to preach, everything kind of changed, because he stood up and looked at us all in the back row, and the first thing he said was, "You're all sinners." And I remember sitting there thinking, well, this is going to be a great night, you know. So anyway, he carried on and said, "But I want you to know that God loves you." And as soon as he said it, it's difficult to articulate it, but it really had an impact on me, certainly, because I remember thinking, you know, this guy doesn't know who we are. He doesn't know the kind of families we come from. But if there is a God and he loves people like us, then that's the kind of God that maybe I hadn't really heard of too much. And he went on to tell us the same thing that these girls had told us about Jesus dying for us on the cross and calling us to repentance and using all of those kinds of words. And yet we all left as if nothing had happened, but something had happened. And a little seed was planted. And to cut a fairly longer story short, 3 weeks later, 4 of us committed our lives to Jesus as a result of this gate crashing couple and hearing this message of a God who loved us enough to let his son die for us. So after that, I went off and joined the army, became a British soldier, and then the rest I've let you know a little bit about. And really, I'd just like to kick us off a little bit by putting a proposition to you, because it has been said that how we come into the kingdom, now whether that was something like me, like a Damascus Road experience where it's a crisis conversion, or whether it's more like an Emmaus Road experience, a journey, or perhaps you were brought up in a Christian family, however that happened, it has been said that how we come into the kingdom will affect how we engage with people outside of the kingdom. And so what I'd like us to do, just to get us starting to think about this, is just take a minute or two and reflect on that. So if I could ask you to reflect on how you come into the kingdom, however that was, and how you now, or how you have generally engaged with those that are not yet believers, and see if there's a correlation because in my story there is most definitely a correlation in that the way those girls came in and were on the front foot, they were proactive in their evangelism. I then went on and in my evangelistic work with the Missionary Society to British soldiers, I was most definitely proactive on the front foot, knocking on doors, arranging events in order to get people to come to a point of commitment. And so if I could just ask you to do that for a minute or two, and then we'll come back again and go on to our next little section.
So do you want us to talk in one big group because there's 10 of us here, or would you rather go into just a couple of breakout rooms? Which would you rather do?
Yeah, or even, this one isn't really going to be long. It's just basically a minute or so where individuals can think themselves where they're at. But it would be good maybe in a minute or so to hear back from if anybody has any thoughts on that. Maybe someone will say, yeah, absolutely. There's a direct correlation how I come into the kingdom and how I now do evangelism or reaching those in the margins. Or likewise, it'd be helpful for those who may say, actually, that doesn't play a part with me. So that would be fantastic.
Okay. Thank you. Everybody's not going to unmute at once, are they?
I think certainly for me, growing up in a Christian family with a dad who was a minister, that kind of thing, that's something that for me is not really replicable unless obviously you expand church planting by having loads of kids, which we try to do. But so I think, yeah, in a sense, it's made me more proactive in terms of my approach, saying actually this is something that I've inherited, but I know that there are thousands who haven't. So how do I then sort of be the first one to help to bring the kingdom in as like a first generation to those people that are far from God, really. So it's kind of an opposite effect for me.
I was just thinking about my experience, and it was a very clear moment of conversion, but realizing that it was after quite a long period of discussion and debate with friends at university, and thinking about how I engage with others. I tend to go for that drawing people in and the discussing and the building of the relationship, rather than a quite direct challenge or Damascus Road type event or discussion.
I hadn't really thought about it until you said that, but just thinking about my own story and reflecting, I can see echoes of, for me, the church accepted us as a single parent family in the 70s, and we felt very much like we belonged and were valued by the church, when lots of places, I grew up in a small village where and in the 70s single parent families weren't looked well upon. I was told to tell people that my dad was working away, and it was a difficult thing, and he'd gone away under a cloud, which we don't need to go into here and stuff, but just the fact that feeling very much as an outsider in everywhere else, but feeling welcomed in the church and being part of community, and growing up, and that's been my story wherever I've been. The church has been a place of welcome, and so I think very much that has been an ethos that I have also encouraged, that we're a place of welcome where people are accepted, known and loved and precious, even if we're not felt like that in other places, I think. But I hadn't really thought about it until you mentioned that, so that's quite interesting.
Agree, really interesting challenge. I came to faith in the wake of an auntie from Australia who just couldn't stop talking, was always bubbling over about the things the Lord had done in her life. And I find myself encouraging people in my church to bubble over in a similar way. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Do follow the pattern.
Yeah, it's not something I've ever reflected on before, but as I thought, yeah, because I came from a family where religion just wasn't talked about, not church at all. In fact, the opposite. And I came to faith very rationally rather than emotionally. And I suspect, yeah, that has affected how I approach other people. I'm much less on the front foot than you described, William, possibly because that was my experience both growing up and in coming to faith. Bears a bit more reflection on, I think.
I've just been wondering whether, in my case, it's a little bit of the opposite, in the sense that I came to faith in a Christian family. I was in church literally the first week of my life, and have never left, except the odd illness. But every Sunday, literally, somewhere. And I'm single. I live on my own. I'm not in a family. There aren't groups of young people around that I grew up with now. So doing evangelism in that setting, so everything is literally different to the way that I came into the kingdom. Everything couldn't be further apart. So it's quite interesting. So it's interesting to see what connections there might be. So I'm just trying to think whether there actually are any connections at all, and probably, but I'm just trying to put a name to them.
I think for me, it's been maybe a gradual process on and off in church throughout my life. But it was through a youth leader when I was 18. And I was drinking heavily with a couple of friends every Friday and Saturday. And we used to go to a youth club on a Friday night after being in the pub. And he challenged us to go to a baptism. A year later, I got baptized myself. And kind of my outlook on evangelism is just walking a journey with people, coming alongside, and eventually praying and I believe in that God will make the difference.
Martin, that raised hand, is that you wanting to come back in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what Kerry had said, because I was thinking the experience of my wife, she's a vicar's daughter, and came to faith very, very, very young, and has always been part of the church community, as Kerry's experience was. And I don't want to speak for her on her experience now, but that must shape, if there are echoes of how we came to faith in how we bring others to faith, then that lifelong experience must shape how some of us relate our faith to others.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I think that's really helpful place to start off with, and it certainly gets us to the point of looking at perhaps how our own journey to faith has had an impact on us, either in mirroring how we engage with others, or likewise perhaps giving us the opposite effect and letting us move beyond where our own experience is and going into a situation of perhaps trying to do things differently or looking at other options. And I think, like anything in the faith that we're journeying on, there's always room to change direction or to learn from others or to have a new way of doing things. So yeah, that's really helpful. So what we're going to do now is just have a very brief look at postmodernism, which may seem like a strange thing to do, but has been really, really helpful to me in my own study of evangelism, and I think probably will make more sense as we look into it, if we haven't already, on how it really has impacted how we engage with people these days. And so I'm very well aware that many of you have possibly looked into this a lot deeper than I have. Perhaps some of you haven't, and perhaps some of you aren't necessarily even very much interested in it, but it's become really fascinating to me. And so let me just, on a very, very broad scale, look at three of the main protagonists in postmodernism, and then we'll break out into little breakout rooms and have a discussion on this and see what comes back. Because postmodernism, I would say, gives us some difficulties when it comes to engaging with those outside of the Christian faith, but it also provides some opportunities, and it'll be interesting to hear how you view that as well. So very, very broadly, postmodernism as a philosophy really began to come together in the mid-20th century. You can trace it back a lot longer than that, but in the mid-20th century, centered around Paris, and three of the main characters in postmodernism that really made it into the philosophy it is today are Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and Michel Foucault. There are lots of other players in this, but if I could concentrate on those three in particular, then and give a very, very broad overview on their premise when it comes to postmodernism. So Jacques Derrida's main strapline is that there is nothing beyond the text. There's nothing beyond the text. And all of this is going to be on a slide that we can put up whenever we're in our breakup rooms or just before or after. So there's nothing beyond the text. And what he means by that is once discourse happens, once words are out of our mouth, or even more importantly, once words are on paper or once they're written, then the idea of the intention of the author is removed, and the interpretation lies solely with those that are listening or with those that are reading. So in that sense, authorial intent is removed from the text. That's what he means by there's nothing beyond the text. So everything is up for discussion. Everything is up for a personal interpretation. And of course, that means that subjectivity plays a large part in how we view the world and how we view philosophy in particular. Very broad on his philosophy, but that's his main tenet. Jean-Francois Lyotard, his argument is there is no meta-narrative, there's no grand narrative, there's no overarching truth or story that holds the universe or holds the human race together. There's no cohesion, and instead of a meta-narrative, there is just a series of small stories that somehow link together into the chaos or the supposed order of the world. So there's no grand narrative, no grand story, just little stories that come together to make the life we live. And Michel Foucault, you could put him in lots of different brackets, but certainly one of the main arguments that he puts forward in postmodernism is that power determines truth. Power determines truth. And so whoever is most aggressive in discourse, whoever is most intelligent, the strongest nation with the greatest military power determines history. And it's seen in how we view history as well, in that, you know, it's often the victor that writes the story of history. And so he views discourse as always being a battle, and it's normally the one who is the aggressor, the one who comes up with the greatest answer, the one who is the most intelligent, that will ultimately determine whatever concept truth is. Now, what I'd like to do is give some...
Sorry,
Yeah,
William, before we go on, can we just pause a moment? Martin Falcourt sounds very much like most diaconates I know, but also, and most importantly, Martin's got his hand up. I think he wanted to say something. So,
Okay.
No, sorry, I hadn't worked out how to drop my hand.
okay, sorry. Carry on.
Yeah, that's okay. And so what I'd like to do is share potentially some difficulties that we have with postmodernism. And then if we could break out into our breakout rooms and discuss what potential opportunities we have, particularly when it comes to engaging those that are outside of the kingdom or those that are not yet believers in Jesus. So if we could look at Jacques Derrida, first of all, and his idea that there is nothing beyond the text. Now, I think there's immediately an issue there when it comes with us suggesting to those who have no faith, firstly, who God is, also what the Bible says, and coming from a posture and position of truth, then we can suggest to people, this is what Jesus said, and this is the kind of call he places on our lives in order to get us to a place of surrender, coming into faith with him, having a relationship with him. Because if we look at the Derridian lifestyle or the Derridian philosophy, then someone could easily push back on that and say, yeah, but this is how I interpret truth, or this is how I interpret Jesus' words, or this is how I interpret the Bible, or even the very essence and nature of God. So we do have a difficulty there. And we're seeing more and more that the context in which we find ourselves, even though postmodernism really came together in the mid-20th century, it happened in the academy. And it normally takes quite a while for it to move from the academy out into contemporary culture. And so we've seen this for quite a long time now, that people are pushing back along the notions of what is truth. There's no such thing as objective truth. This is my truth. And so they could do that in a Derridian way and say, well, this is how I would understand the Bible. This is how I would view the claims that Jesus would make on society. And actually, what Jesus said isn't what you have traditionally understood him to mean. And so we're going to have some pushback on that. And so that's a bit of a difficulty. And so it'd be wonderful if we could discuss that in our little groups to see what opportunities that affords us when we engage with people. Likewise, Jean-Francois Lyotard, there is no meta-narrative now. I'm aware that we'll all look at theology very differently. So if you look at biblical theology, the very particular practice and discipline of biblical theology, you'll know that it holds very dearly to the redemptive storyline of Scripture, all the way from Genesis to Revelation, that there is, as some people might say, the crimson cord or the scarlet thread, and it's all about the work of Jesus on the cross. And so when we take that away, then there is really no great meta narrative, no grand story. And people are going to say that to us when we engage with them. They're going to say, yeah, but here's my story, and my story matters. And that's what Lyotard was pushing for, that life is made up of individual smaller stories and not one grand story. So that does provide a difficulty for us, but likewise, I do think it provides opportunity for us as well. And likewise with Michel Foucault, where power determines truth. And of course, we have those classic sayings in Scripture where Jesus says, I am the truth. And he certainly wasn't aggressive. He wasn't someone who just tried to win the argument. He wasn't someone who came from a posture of trying to enforce anything. In fact, we know with the story of the rich young ruler, perhaps Foucauldian approach to that would have been to go after the young man as he walked away, but Jesus lets him go because he was more into dialogue and question and engaging with people rather than enforcing something on people. So again, it provides a difficulty for us. If we are to engage with people, how do we deal with that? Do we go down the line of apologetics, which does have an element of, let me give you truth from my posture of certainty? Or do we engage with them from a posture of, well, let's engage together and hear what you're saying, and I'll let you know what my understanding is. And so, yeah, when it comes to particularly these three areas of postmodern philosophy, and we can see that all around us today. It was 1998 when the Manic Street Preachers brought out their iconic CD, This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours. And I think the world that we live in lives in that tension. And yet here we are trying to reach people in the margins with that kind of understanding. How are we going to do it? So postmodernism provides us with difficulties, also provides us with opportunities. If we could break out into some breakout rooms and potentially discuss what those opportunities may be, still staying within a context of understanding postmodernism, how are we going to do that? So, Jonathan, could we do that?
Absolutely. I'll break us into two groups. I'm just going to pause the recording now.
Awesome. Before we go on to just our next session, and I believe we're going to take a break around about 11 o'clock, isn't that right? Perhaps before we go on to the next slide, is there anyone who has anything particularly pertinent that they'd like to share from their breakout room?
I think one thing that really struck me, and I'll be reading it, is Jonathan talking about Douglas Copeland's book about stories, and I think that's something I've increasingly be coming back to as well. That power of the short, the individual stories and how they fit together in the absence of the big and meta narrative. But there is that there is still a search for the meta narrative within each one of us, and how do we tie that in with stories? If that was a fair summary of what you said, Jonathan, but yeah, definitely going to go back and read that.
Yeah, I think so. I was just talking about, and this won't come as any surprise to one or two people, the book Life After God by Douglas Copeland, which is a whole book of short stories. The premise is, what is it like to be the first generation to be growing up without God as the story of our lives? And so he's just written a collection of short stories back in the early 90s about what that looks like. But the conclusion and the place he kind of gets to, and he's not a Christian writer, and I'm not going to spoil the whole book for you because the stories are worth reading on their own, some incredible stories. But he gets to this place. Now, here is my secret. I tell it to you with an openness of heart that I doubt I shall ever achieve again. So I pray that you're in a quiet room as you hear these words. My secret is that I need God, that I'm sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem to be capable of giving, to help me be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness, and to help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. And so this is a secular writer kind of saying, I've written all these stories about what it means to live life without having the story of God. And here's my conclusion. We need God, which is really good news for us, isn't it?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think for our group as well, the power of story really came across. And one of the things that we pulled out is that perhaps telling our story adds some authenticity to who we are and adds into the grander story of perhaps even a redemptive community as well. Okay, we'll move on to the next section, and then we'll take a break at around 11. So just to let you know that I did a number of years of research on a shift in evangelism, and that was a shift from a more traditional, some may say evangelical approach to evangelism to a more progressive, emerging, potentially liberal approach to evangelicalism. And all I'm going to do now, or evangelism, all I'm going to do now is go through 7 shifts. It won't be too long, 7 shifts of where we used to view evangelism and how it perhaps was practiced, and how that has changed, is being changed in some circles, perhaps not all, but in many circles, and it's becoming more of an emerging shift towards perhaps a more postmodern approach to evangelism. And so somewhere on these 7 scales, you're going to find yourself, I would imagine, and you'll either be familiar with the more traditional, perhaps evangelical view of evangelism, or the more progressive, moving towards liberal, emerging view of evangelism. Forgive me for the labels, and you may not jump into any of those, but I'm just using them for ease today. And what I'd like us to do is just consider these shifts, and perhaps have a think of where you are on the scale of traditional or progressive. Also, perhaps consider where your church is, if you're leading a church, and also perhaps even more importantly, consider where your community is, because that's going to be really important if we're going to do anything in reaching them. Okay, so here we go, 7 shifts, and you may agree or disagree with any of these, and please feel free to do that whenever we come to the end. So 7 shifts in evangelism from traditional evangelical perspective to a more progressive, perhaps postmodern perspective. And the first is that evangelism has tended to be shifting from preaching as evangelism to discussion as evangelism. And so you'll know and you'll be aware that evangelism used to be the Billy Graham effect. It used to be the street preacher out on the street. It used to be the United Beach Mission, someone with a microphone, someone with a loud voice, one person in a church, potentially, if you have a church-based evangelistic event, one person preaching, this is truth and you need to get right with Jesus. So that kind of approach. And that has shifted more towards a discussion-based approach, of course, with the likes of Alpha, Christianity Explored, and lots of other course-based discussion groups when it comes to evangelism. And that really fits more with where society has been moving, where it's not just one authority figure giving a posture of authority and truth, but moving more toward, well, let's discuss the claims of the Bible or the claims of Jesus together. So that's definitely one shift that has been happening. The next shift is that the church tended to, in a more traditional method, put all of their approach to giving out the gospel, let's say, as a posture of looking at truth, whereas a more progressive view would be looking at experience. And what I mean by that is that we used to be able to say, well, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me, and leave it there, almost just relegating that to the work of the Holy Spirit, which for many people that has worked. What we're seeing now is more of a shift towards an experience. So the likes of the Alpha Course, and saying, okay, what we're doing is we're letting people experience a little sense of a group, a sense of a community, together walking this journey. And it's when we walk this journey together, that's when we'll be able to imbibe some measure of truth. And so there's a shift in that. Shift number 3 of 7 is that traditionally there has been a posture of absolute certainty when it came to engaging those that are not Christians or not yet believers, where we say, this is truth, this is absolute fact, and this is what we're offering to you, or demanding of you in some cases. Whereas there is a shift towards going into a more conversation style or journey style of evangelism, where we come in with a sense of ambiguity, perhaps a better word is mystery. And we're not saying, okay, we've got all of the answers neatly packaged, but we do have some claims to truth as according to Jesus or as according to the New Testament, or however we convey that. And we're also saying that we don't have all of the answers, but here are truth claims that we're offering to you. And there is room for mystery. There is room for saying, I don't have all the answers, but let's still walk this journey together. Shift number 4 is that there has been a shift from focusing our evangelistic efforts on eternity. In other words, we do this because you're either going to go to heaven or go to hell, and moving that more towards a focus on the present. Some people call it kingdom now, so that it's not just, okay, if we give our lives to Jesus, we have a ticket to heaven. If we don't, we're going to hell. It's more a case of, if we give our lives to Jesus, eternity starts now, and our life with him and our journey with him starts now, and we can begin to see our own lives transformed and the lives around us transformed, or the world around us transformed as a result of that. Number 5 is that, again, traditionally there was a plea for soul salvation. And when we look at evangelism, we can see that in the New Testament. We can see that in how evangelism has been presented in more traditional evangelical churches in particular, where you're pushing for the person to give their lives to Jesus so their soul would be saved. And there's been more of a shift towards, without losing that aspect of it, there has been more of a shift in the progressive sides of the church, where it's more towards looking at creation or earth salvation. Maybe creation is a better word for that. But whenever we give our lives to Jesus, we begin to see the creation around us. So it feeds into green issues, it feeds into areas of social justice, and that's also part of salvation. And so we've seen a shift from only focusing on a commitment of the soul, where the soul is saved, to, okay, well, if I am a Christian, and if I become a Christian, and if they become Christians, then that has an impact on creation, that has an impact on the world that we live in. Number 6 is that we have a traditional, more evangelical view on repentance. So you're pushing for a decision, and once that decision is made, then that's it, you're in. And it's the whole idea of, you know, if you believe what we believe, then you'll become and you'll ultimately belong. Whereas that has been questioned, and in some sections of the church that has been flipped, looking at perhaps more of a Jesus method of inviting the disciples in and journeying together. So you belong, first of all, you can belong with us. And hopefully in the journeying, then at some point you'll begin to see the lifestyle that we live, see the values of the lifestyle that we live, and you may start to believe what we believe and ultimately become, or that can be flipped. Maybe if it's, first of all, you belong, and then you'll start to become like us. And then at the very end, actually, you'll believe what we believe as well. And so that's definitely up for discussion as well. And then finally, evangelism traditionally has often, and we see this in churches all over the place, it has often just reflected on the evangelist of the church, or people in the church that have a sense of, or a call to evangelism. And you know, you can point them out in lots of local churches. And so we've tended to say, well, the evangelist is for evangelism. Whereas there's more of a shift of moving away from that, without losing it, moving away from that to the community as a whole. And so it's not just the evangelist that's sent into the community, it's the church as a whole that's sent into the community. And there's more of a community witness, rather than one person having a calling or a gifting to be the evangelist. there's more of a community witness. And we see this with the likes of the food banks that are happening. We see this with the likes of community groups that are started by churches in order to perhaps bring people in. It's not particularly evangelistic, but we could call it pre-evangelism. And this is the community shining a light as a community into, as a community witness into the wider community that are not yet believers. And so there are 7 definite shifts. You may have more, or you may disagree with any of those. But what I'd love us to do is perhaps just before going into a break, if we could put that slide up, and if we could just have a minute or two to have a look. On the left-hand side, you're going to see more of a traditional evangelical view on what evangelism has been and still is in some contexts, and moving towards more of a progressive view on what evangelism is or potentially could be. I think someone was wanting to say something. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just had somebody at the door. If that was me referring to, apologies.
That's okay. That's okay. So, Jonathan, could we do that? Could we perhaps put the slide up?
It's up beside you. It's spotlighted beside you, so we can all see you and the slides next to you. In fact, we've been doing that for the whole of your presentation.
You are a legend. Thank you. So if we could just take a minute or two, and then we could have a break. Have a look at that. Have a look at the slide. Have a look at the list on the left-hand side. Are you more familiar with that? Is that your background? Is that what you're continuing to do? And there's no right or wrong here. We're just trying to find out where we're at, because it's going to make a difference to what we're going to look at a little bit later. Or are you more on the right-hand side? Is that more your style? Is that more where your church is at? Or is that more where your community is at? Which of those approaches fits you? Which of those approaches fits your church? And which of those approaches fits your community? So maybe just for the sake of saving time, if you could just have a look at that, have a little think, and then maybe, Jonathan, we could have a little break on your command, or you or David.
David's hosting today.
Thanks.
So I've been talking away and I was muted. Rookie error. Folks, shall we take a break and come back? Should we say 10 minutes? Is that enough time for your kettle to boil? In that case, we will see you all in, let's say 10 past 11. All right? Fantastic.
Super, thank you. Yeah, I hope that little slide helped in the sense of getting just an idea of where probably you're at, although you would have known that, but certainly where your church is at and where your context is at when we look at engaging with our context. And what I'd like to do on this next slide is look at a particular demographic. And for me, I'm going to use a working class demographic. I'm going to use a working class male over 18 demographic, because that's what I've been used to for probably most of my ministry, is reaching that group. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to work down some helps that have helped me to engage with this demographic. However, it's going to be fairly easy for you to take wherever you're at and translate that into either a middle class context or a context of reaching people with issues of sexuality that may not necessarily be accepted by certain sections of the church, or it may work for you looking at your demographic of those that are perhaps from an offending criminal background. Whatever your context is, whoever is on the margins within your community, You're going to be able to translate what I'm about to say into their world. And so what I'll do is I'll just look down these 8 things that have really been helps to me, and hopefully they'll help you as you think about your own context and engaging with those on the margins within your own context. So for me, looking at the demographic of working class males over the age of 18, first thing I would say is your story helps. Your story helps. And for me, I have a story that has a certain amount of brokenness in it, and their stories tend to have that. And so whenever I share my own brokenness with them, it tends to make a little bit of a bridge. And I would say for you, potentially, if you're sharing something of your story, whenever we reveal our own brokenness, it often links in with the brokenness of others in whatever kind of context. And so that definitely helps. Secondly, an understanding of their culture helps. And culture is, as you know, very different within different groups within our own nation and country. And so, you know, a culture within the working class or a culture within certain other sections of the community are going to have their own identifiers. And so for me, I come from a working class background, so understanding their culture is going to help that and understand where they're coming from. And it helps me not to say things that are utterly inappropriate, I hope. But likewise, even if you're not from their culture, you can still find out about their culture in order to be sensitive whenever you're talking to them, whoever they may be. And thirdly, for me, looking at working class males over the age of 18, following their sports really helps. And so working class males over the age of 18 tend to not look at things like ice skating or hockey. They'll look at who's fighting in the cage this weekend, or what horses are on form, or who's winning the darts. I'm really trying not to be too putting people in too much of a box there, but that tends to be the case. Now, whatever context you're finding yourself in, and whatever group of people on the margins that you're going to be engaging with or are engaging with, you could easily swap the word sports for passions. So find out what they're interested in and follow it, because it really, really helps. It helps me keeping abreast of who's at the top of the Premier League whenever I engage with these kinds of guys. So fourthly, straight talking helps. That may not translate into who you're trying to reach, but certainly with working class males over the age of 18, shooting from the hip is going to help, and it has helped me many, many times. They don't like anything wishy-washy. They don't like to sit and philosophize about things. However, the people on the margins in your context may be very different. So they may like to sit and discuss things. They may not like the straight talk. They may prefer to look at things more academically or more along the lines of philosophy, or they may put it in a different package than maybe even you're used to. And so, yeah, I would say for me, talking to that kind of demographic, straight talking helps. For you, it could be very, very different. Fifth, yeah, involvement helps. The next one, involvement helps. And so what I mean by that is involvement in where they're at. So if there's a football team, I've joined it. If there is a boxing club, I boxed for a long time. So if there's a boxing club, I join it. If you have a dog, go and walk your dog where they walk their dogs. Try to get some kind of interaction. If there are clubs in your community that you or the church that you're part of or leading could join, try to join those clubs. Although I would say there's a caveat to that. Try to join a club that you would enjoy, or try to get those in the church to join a club that they would enjoy. And so involvement in their world is always going to help. It cuts away the sense of distance. and just brings us closer to where they're at. Thinking of a context that I've been used to, and that is reaching the working class, particularly males over the age of 18. Talking of Jesus as the transformer of lives has really helped. Now, that may help in your context, and it may be very different in your context. So if I talk to working class males over the age of 18 of Jesus as a social warrior, it probably wouldn't fly, but it may do that in your context. In the context I've been in, it has been more of the ability of Jesus to transform someone's lives, because that's what they're looking for, as the one coming in as savior, as healer as well in some regard. But what does your context say, and what would your context benefit from in your portrayal of who Jesus is? Now, I'm not saying we twist who Jesus is, because Jesus is more things than just a life transformer. He is certainly that, but he is more things than that. And so I would say try to find out where your context is and how we could feed into that. In talking about the particular demographic of males over 18 from a working class background, I would say that close discipleship helps. So as soon as someone either makes a decision to become a Christian or is walking that journey, then a close partnering or a friendship is almost essential. And in effect, you become their spiritual mother or father for a season, because often they're coming out of very broken backgrounds. And so a real walking alongside them is going to help. Now, your context may be different. It may not demand that of you. And I have been in contexts where it's best to kind of let them walk on with others in the church community that are going to fit them better than you will do. And so that's a discernment process for you to understand. And then finally, certainly for me, whenever I first became a Christian, and for those within the working class over 18 male category, early evangelism really helps. Early evangelism helps in the sense of them owning their new life. So whenever the four of us committed our lives to Jesus, that was a Sunday evening. And on the Tuesday evening, this little church did open air services, and they got each of us to tell our testimony. I mean, a couple of days later, after becoming Christian, and you know what? It was frightening. It was scary. But looking back, I understand the wisdom of that, and it really helped us to own our faith. Because all our friends were outdoors that evening watching and listening. So that really helped us. But it could also help in your demographic as well. But you'll understand your context better than I would understand your context. So this slide is really just more about trying to focus on those in the margins that are around you, around your church, around what you're trying to do. Who are those people? Where are they in the margins? Why are they in the margins? And what is going to help you reach them? So if possible, if that's okay, if we could just take a few minutes just to, we can still stay on, just take, say, 2 minutes or so, just to have a look at that list. It's particularly for working class males over 18, but is there anything in that list that could either translate directly across to where you're at and the people in the margins that you're trying to reach, or is it something that would completely need to shift in some regard? And what is it that would need to shift if you were to try to reach those in your demographic, or those that you're trying to reach in the margins that you've been making inroads into? So if we could put that slide up, or have that slide up. Thanks for keeping the slide up, Jonathan. And have a think about that for a minute or two, and then it'd be great to hear some feedback from you or from anybody that would like to share something. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Martin. I would say both. there's a suggestion when we talk about the margins, are we talking about the margins of society or the margins of our church? And yeah, I would definitely say both. Wherever you find the margins are, and how close they may be to where you're at, or how very, very far removed away from where you're at, and how do we bridge that gap to getting there? I mean, even on just first reading or first looking at that, is there anything, perhaps you have a story to tell of where you have been able to reach into the margins, or perhaps you have something to share along the lines of, well, it's been really difficult to reach this group because that would be really helpful too.
For me, just a quick comment on the very final help there, which is about immediate evangelism, and the urgency of that, really, because, you know, how long are people within the community of faith before they lose a lot of the connections from their previous life and lifestyle and stuff? And actually, if the evangelism isn't fairly immediate, the meaningful connections with the friendship circle, that network of friends, relatives, associates and neighbors that they were in before, begins to erode quite quickly as stronger relationships form within the community of faith. So there's not only that personal discipleship dynamic, which is hugely important, but the missional dynamic here, which is hugely important. That, you know, the best person to win somebody like them is them, you know.
William, just wondering, in the context, I think everybody on the screen is in leadership of one form or another. Just sharing with one of my congregation a little bit about sharing their story, their walk with Jesus. I've been told that that's a personal thing, and I don't do that sort of thing. What would be your rationale wisdom to encourage maybe a pastor, a church leader, to be able to encourage their members, congregation, fellowship to put into practice what you just shared?
Yeah, I think I totally agree. It's not an easy thing to motivate others to share their story. It frightens the life out of lots of people, and I would say that if at some points you could slot into, and this is where it's helped me. I'm not suggesting that everybody does this, but sometimes when I've slotted into particularly sermons on Sundays, a little interaction that I've had with people, and let them know the successes, but let them also know the failures, and let people know that you're human as well. Because I think a lot of people in our churches really do think this is just for the evangelists. It's just for those that have all the answers. It's just for those that really know the Bible. It's just for those that have a real extrovert personality, or it's just for those that have an ability to very quickly link with someone. And if you could break some of those things down and say, you know, that it is for everybody. And here's something that happened to me. One of the great things that happened to us very recently was there was a lady in our church, early 70s, never really done anything like this before. And she told me privately that she had a conversation with her neighbor for the first time, I think, ever, about her own story of faith. And it so excited her that she did it. And I said to her, listen, would it be okay if I shared that story with the church? Because I think that will encourage people. And she kind of thought, but then she said, yeah, okay, you can share it. And we shared it with the church, and it did something. It's hard to kind of articulate that, but it let people know, actually, you know, if she in her early 70s can do that for the first time, then maybe I could do something like that. And so that was a real help for us as well. But it's also, I think it's sharing that it's not just for the professionals, it's not for those that know everything about the Bible. It's okay to say to someone that you're engaging with, I don't know the answer to that, you know, but to tell our story raw as it is, I think that has really helped us where we're at the moment.
One of the things I was thinking about as I was reading that list is how much we've sort of professionalized evangelism in a lot of ways. You know, we do modules on it on college and whole courses. And I think our church has sort of absorbed the fact that, you know, I've only got my story. That's not important enough to share. You need to bring in a professional evangelist, which I'm not sure works particularly with those on the margins. And I'm not sure is how the early church operated. And I'm not sure it's how we should be operating. Somehow we've lost the grassroots element of evangelism in a lot of our churches. Not all, but some. You know,
I think one of the difficulties, of course, I completely agree with that. One of the difficulties is that those of us that are leading churches, if we either consciously or subconsciously put forward the idea that we're really good at this, and we kind of tell stories that we're really good at this, you know, and we tell the big stories, and hey, 3 people gave their lives to Jesus, and that's wonderful, and if that happens, that's okay. But you know, there are lots of times when it doesn't work, and I think it's okay to have a little bit of humility to reflect that to those that we're leading as well, and say, you know, I fell flat on my face that time, didn't know what to say, and kind of walked away with a red face. And that's sometimes more helpful than some of the success stories we have. I think, you know, you're absolutely right.
I think perhaps creating safe spaces where it's okay to try things out if you've got that kind of ethos in your fellowship, in your community, and also sort of telling your story doesn't need to be from the beginning to the end. Because that seems quite daunting for some people, you know, and if you're invited to tell your story, it could just be tell your story of something that's happened to you in this last week or just a short bit, and just having little snippets might feel safer for people to do. And the other thing is that, just another thought, I'm just off the top of my head, things I was thinking was that sometimes I think it's really helpful for people to hear more ordinary, boring stories than the great, huge Damascus Road stories, which are great and wonderful and have impact on people. But some people just go, well, my story is going to be nothing like that. And I couldn't possibly tell that story because my story compared to these great big stories is nothing. But if you have several opportunities where people are telling quite ordinary stories, as it were, that encourages others that their story has some worth and value, perhaps.
I was looking at the 2 lists you've given us of the shifts. I was going to add an 8th one, which perhaps sums things up, which is from propositional to relational. And actually, the list you've given there for the over 18 working class males is actually about having a genuine relationship with them. And so it's finding what that genuine relationship is. I was really challenged a few weeks ago, but then encouraged a few days ago by an elderly couple in their 90s who've really been shut off and are struggling during this lockdown period, and are really embarrassed that there's nothing they could do. They were active in church life all their life. There's nothing they could do, and also embarrassed that they were unable to look after themselves. So having these carers come in, and it's all embarrassing and all humiliating. And what can we do as a church to help them? How can we do things for the church? Anyway, that was a few weeks ago. A few days ago, she's on the phone to me. Oh, we're sharing our faith with our carers. We're having this whole succession of people coming in, and we're just telling them all about Jesus. And now one of them came back and asked me to pray for her and asked me to do these. So I'm thinking they were praying to be useful and actually are doing what you've been talking about in their context, what we're talking about. And they're actually now useful in this evangelistic task they've been engaged in all their lives and want to continue in their mid-90s.
Wow.
It strikes me, William, that this list, the first probably 5 items on it are all about building trust. And certainly our experience, one of the sort of the marginal communities we're engaged with is through we were able to set up a drop-in, a community drop-in on the high street, which just open to anyone for anything really. We'll give you a cuppa and we have a chat or whatever, and it's been about 5 years, led to many different relationships and the like. And out of that, I mean, well, there's always, without initiating anything, there's always spiritually loaded conversations going on in there among the clients, and many of them, and they do tend to be. Well, they've got all sorts of issues, mental health, addictions, all sorts of things, but tend to come from a middle-aged to old-aged demographic. And many of them have got some sort of church background, which hasn't been helpful. Just this particular area, many of them have got a Catholic heritage, which you know has damaged them in some way. And so, in a sense, our job for over months and even years with some of them is just building trust. And actually, we're Christians, and you can trust us. We're okay. We're not going to do the things that religion has done to you previously. And it's like provide a platform for when we do run an alpha or whatever it might be, that actually, yeah, I'll come along to that. In a way that there was no way we could have made that step without that groundwork and just building the relationship in the community.
Definitely in a previous context I was in, there was a group that we set up as like a Bible study group. It just so happened that people were drawn to that because they had been burnt by traditional evangelical certainty, and they had all got lots of doubts. So they were kind of in that sort of post deconstructing, reconstructing, and it was a safe place for them to be able to express their doubts without feeling that they were going to be chastised or excluded. And it just so happened that group drew that, and that group grew, and they grew deeper in their faith and in their confidence, and sort of rediscovered their faith, or well, not that they'd lost it in some ways, but they felt validated in being able to express it. So that was quite helpful for drawing people who'd drifted away and then were wanting to come back.
Going back to what David was saying about we've professionalized evangelism, one of the things that struck me about the turning movement with Yinka over the last few years is that although it doesn't tie in very well with story and narrative and dialogue, what it seemed to be very good was at finding a way of empowering members of the church to get involved in evangelism. What I think we could do with is finding a way of doing that within a more postmodern setting. I've not been directly involved in any of the events around the turning, but I understand it quite programmatic with sets of questions and in some ways a very traditional way of doing evangelism. But it would be interesting if we could find a way of empowering people within some sort of framework to do it within a much more relational way that we're talking about here.
That could be another session, I'm guessing. But I think it would be a worthy one. It's 25 to 12. We're going to finish probably a little before 12. So if I could push on and go into our final little slide, and then just give you some time to have a think about where do we go from here, because that's what this last slide is about. So what are we going to do with this? Where are we going to go in our own context? And so looking into the rest of 21, looking into 2022, what are we going to do? I mean, on the slide, we're going to have some options. Are we going to plan something in with those that we're leading? Are we going to do that ourselves and model that for others? Are we going to have a small group around us where we could begin engaging with those on the margins? Or are we going to perhaps teach on this in our churches and just see what comes out of that? Perhaps you're already doing course evangelism, or maybe that would be a good next step for you to doing an alpha course, or doing another alpha course. A friend of mine says, you know, the strapline, of course, the alpha is, surely there's more to life than this. And my friend, after doing alpha for about 10 years, said, surely there's more to life than alpha. And I think, you know, that's a very valid point. Is there an evangelistic course that you or you with a team from your church could write yourselves specifically for your context, rather than always relying on Alpha or Christianity Explored or whatever course you prefer? Are you going to maybe have an event coming up in the next season of restrictions dropping, where you can invite others into the church very safely? Are you going to teach people? Perhaps you have expertise in this, and you can teach people how to do one-to-one conversations or training, or rather you'd rather have the whole church mobilized to some degree, and that's how you're going to lead the church. Or maybe you can work off the church calendar. I mean, we've just had Easter, and Pentecost is coming. Or you can already now start thinking about Christmas, and what are we going to do? Could we do something that's quite evangelistic to some degree, either low level, medium, or high level, where people do come in and they can engage with the Christian story to some degree? Are you going to release the evangelists that are in your church? Or are you going to identify them? Perhaps you have already done that. Are there others that could join a small team that could go out and do the work as representatives of your church? Or perhaps you might be in a position where you could employ an evangelist, although I do agree with the comment, that could almost be professionalizing the role, and everybody else sets back. So there is a danger to that as well. Or you could start a community group as pre-evangelism. Give you an example of what we have done of this last year. About a year ago, as a leadership team, we went away for a day's retreat and tried to discern what God was saying to us. And we had a sense that God wanted us to be a real hub for the community. And over this last year, we've built a community cafe in the church, and we're hoping that that becomes something where we engage with people. Now, we're not going to be, forceful and jumping down people's throats as soon as they come in. We're just creating space for people to come in and use our cafe and hopefully build up some of those relationships that was being talked about there. And so is that something that you could potentially do? Or could you start an art group in the church? Could you start a knit and natter group? Could you start a football team? I don't know. You'll know your church better than I know your church. And so what is going to work for your context? I guess that's this last slide really. And consider, is it going to be something as low level over the next year as maybe just taking someone for coffee, you yourself, and sharing your story? Or is it going to be something high level where you do a big evangelistic event and invite the whole community, if that happens? But having a flexible plan is better than having no plan, I would say. And so what I'd love for us to do now is just take a few minutes and consider what is next for me. And if you don't mind, I'd like to pray for you, because we don't do this on our own. And some of us are wired to the point where we could come up with a 5-point strategy in 10 minutes, but it's not really about that. It's about, God, what are you saying? What are you saying to me? What are you saying to our church? What are you saying to this community? And so maybe if I could just pray for us as we consider this last slide. And after I finish, maybe if we have just a couple of minutes where you say, God, what's on your heart for my context? Maybe one idea, maybe something will come to your mind, and then we'll begin to round up. So let me pray for you, and then we can do that. Father, thank you that we don't do this on our own. This isn't our kingdom, it's your kingdom. I want to thank you for the sense of desire and passion that everyone that's here today has for reaching their community. So much so that we're engaging with each other on these issues. And Father, I do ask you that you would just reveal something by your Spirit to each of us about our own context. Would you give us an idea or ideas? Would you perhaps point people out to us in the church that may help? Would you give us a sense of your leading? Would you would you speak to us? And would you give us ears to hear? Help us to understand what you're saying to us as churches, as leaders, and as communities. So, Father, as we consider these things, just for the next minute or two, I'm asking that you would speak, that you would say something that would be along the lines of, have you thought about this? Or even, you're going in the right direction, keep going. Whatever it may be, Father. Would you speak to us now in Jesus' name? Amen. So perhaps as we continue to think about those things and certainly continue to pray into those things, it's 11:45. David, if I could hand over to you to say that as far as the slides have gone, that's me done. I know there is one final slide that if anybody wants to get in touch with me, or I can push resources your way, or book titles or anything like that have been particularly helpful, then I'd be very, very happy to do that. And yeah, contact me at any point. But David, if I could hand back over to you and just say to everyone, thank you so much for engaging. And I honestly do pray that God will bless you as you reach out into the communities that are around you. And you know, many of you probably doing an amazing job anyway. And so, yeah, God bless you as you continue to do that. And I really do ask, and will continue to ask God that He will inspire all of us so that we're in step with His Spirit as we try to reach those that are in the margins and that are around us that don't know Jesus, but could do with knowing Him. So, David, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, William. I come to these sessions every time, and I always leave with having done a 2-hour seminar with about 4 hours worth of thinking to do, which is good. It's what they should be. They should raise questions and challenge, and you've certainly done that today. So thank you. Just a reminder that this is one of a series of sessions, and our next one, I had it up on my screen, here we go. The next one is going to be on the 6th of May in a month's time. This one it's usually on the first Thursday of the month. This one was out of skelter because of Easter. 6th of May, Emma Nash, one of our members, is doing a session on including and ministering to the childless in our church, and it will deal with all sorts of issues of infertility, of intentional childlessness, and all that. And if ever, like me, you've struggled with Mother's Day services and other family occasions, and even the language that we use in church of family talks, family services, and so on, you won't want to miss that. The booking for that is not, I think, up at the moment, is it, Jonathan? But it will be very, very shortly. Jonathan?
No, it's up. It's up. The link
It's up.
that
Okay.
I sent you. Well, it's all live. I don't know that. Have we shared it in the groups yet?
Not yet, but we will do.
It's live.
We
It's all
will
live.
do either today or tomorrow. So
It's on the mail out that went out last week from Tim, by the way, on Friday. Last Friday, he sent a mailing out, last Thursday, perhaps he sent a mail out. It's on there.
So please don't be afraid to miss. Don't miss that. And that's it. Other than to say, God bless you, everybody, and be blessed and fruitful in your ministry and your evangelism and reaching out to those on the margins. Bless you.